Sushi!
In 2013, the main series Pokemon games finally introduced 3D models for every single Pokemon there was. That must have been a lot of work for the developers, and we can actually start to see that as we look into the cracks of these 3D models. Today, I want to look further into some of the obscure oddities I found within these 3D models, and by the end of the list, we're going to be looking at obscurities I doubt you've ever seen before. Up first, we have to talk about the elephant, or I guess honey badger, in the room, Typhlosion. Most people's problem with the 3D model for Typhlosion is the fact that its flames aren't always lit, but instead light up in battle. And to be honest, I don't actually have much of a problem with this, and it makes a lot of sense. Especially considering in other channels like the Pokemon anime, we see this is how Typhlosion functions. His flames aren't always lit like other Pokemon like Infernape. And I think a lot of people don't talk about the fact that Hisuian Typhlosion in the game's Legends of Arceus actually has his flame lit whenever he's in battle, not just for the 5 brief seconds that he uses a move, and I think that's a better way to handle this 3D model. And I'm pretty sure Game Freak has acknowledged this logic, considering in Scarlet and Violet, now even regular Typhlosion's flames will always be lit. And let's just get the second most talked about 3D model out there, Hitmontop. Of course, it's so weird how he's always standing and only spins briefly during one of his moves. The weird part about this is, unlike Typhlosion, Game Freak have just never fixed this guy. Next, we need to talk about flying Pokemon. Or should I say, floating Pokemon. In Pokemon X and Y, when we first got 3D models for every Pokemon, not every flying Pokemon was, well, flying. Some Pokemon's models who were flying type or had the levitate ability were just standing on the ground. And one of those Pokemon is Hawlucha. The weird thing about Hawlucha is that in Pokemon X and Y, during Sky battles, the battles for Sky and flying type Pokemon, Hawlucha cannot take part. Now, I have mentioned this in another video, and you guys did mention that Hawlucha is mainly a wrestling Pokemon who just happens to have great acrobat skills, and that only kind of makes sense. It doesn't really solve this problem, and I'll tell you why. There's actually 3 main issues with this. First of all, Hawlucha, even in X and Y during its debut, can learn the Pokemon move Fly, even though some Pokemon that can participate in Sky battles like Carnivine can't. The second being that Hawlucha's 3D model debuted with Sky battles in the same game X and Y like we've talked about. So why not just model Hawlucha's 3D model to be flying? Wouldn't that make a whole lot more sense? And the third reason is that Hawlucha does have a flying 3D model, so now there's just no excuse. That 3D model was only introduced in Scarlet and Violet, but Hawlucha has never changed apart from its new Mega in Legends EA, so how come suddenly now it can fly? And this is a good chance to talk about Scarlet and Violet. Many Pokemon have these 2 3D models, and they either have a standing pose or a flying pose, both of which count as separate models, and the only way to activate that flying type model is if you send that Pokemon out directly after you sent out a flying type Pokemon. It's really confusing, and I don't know why Game Freak made this so specific. Just either give it both models randomly or just one. However, I do think this is a cool feature, but it just makes me beg the question, Pokemon like Heracross and Metagross, how come they don't have the ability Levitate if they can fly? How come you can hit them with ground type moves? Isn't that what the ability Levitate was made for in the first place? And the Pokemon Company have even hammered down on this themselves, considering that Gengar always had the ability Levitate, but in Sun and Moon they removed that ability from the Pokemon, because you know, it's standing up. So why isn't the opposite applied to the opposite when Pokemon like Heracross can suddenly fly? Ironically, in the same game Scarlet and Violet, we also saw a trend of a lot of flying type Pokemon now just being on the ground. For me, this is a good design choice, as many flying type Pokemon were kind of just awkwardly hanging in the air without even flapping their wings. I think Pokemon, especially like Charizard, just look way better now. And then there is the Magnemite line of Pokemon. And to be fair, these guys have never had the ability to levitate, but why? I will never look at these guys and not assume they have that ability because they've never touched around. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Now for the next obscurity in this list, can any of you tell me what these 2 Pokemon have in common? You shouldn't, because they have nothing in common, and that's why I want to talk about them today. Ekans is such a strange Pokemon because of the way the developers decided to animate him. In some Pokemon games, like Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, Ekans moves like its name spelled backwards, as it should do. But for whatever reason, the Pokemon games Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, you know, the ones that came out years later after Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee already got this right, Game Freak, or I guess Elka decided no, that's not good enough, and decided to animate Ekans sliding across the ground like a piece of butter, still in its coil for whatever reason. Sometimes it feels like these 3D models are evolving, but just backwards. And then you get Pokemon like Alolan Sandshrew, which I think is the pinnacle of 3D models, and that all boils down to its running animation, where it sort of curls up like a puck in ice hockey and slides across the floor. It's just so cool. I feel like 3D models are a great way for Game Freak to have a chance to show off the real biology and potential of these Pokemon when they're not limited to a 2D sprite. And sometimes they do that perfectly, like with Alolan Sandshrew, but sometimes, like with Nidoking for example, the Pokemon just seems less fierce and therefore worse. And sometimes I feel like, especially with these newer Pokemon, they need 3D models to even exist. Sometimes it feels like 3D models aren't an afterthought, but a way Game Freak can create new Pokemon. And one of those Pokemon, in my opinion, is another Alolan form, that being Alolan Muk. And some people and fans have made 2D sprites of this 3D Pokemon, but it just doesn't work the same way, and I love Alolan Muk. Again, a great example of how a 3D model can bring a Pokemon to life. Just a side note, did you know Bayleef's leaf on top of its head isn't 2D and flat? Well, I didn't, and most people probably did as they watched the anime and this was shown to them, but for people like me, the only thing I had to go off was the 2D models in the Pokemon games I played. Just goes to show, a lot of Pokemon I feel like with 2D sprites aren't properly being represented. Now we're going to get a little more obscure as we talk about the Pokemon Staryu. Staryu has a feature on its body, just like Bayleef. You probably noticed it if you've watched the anime before. On one of Staryu's legs, it has a strap that connects its leg to its gem on the front face of its body. I find this especially odd considering its evolution Starmie doesn't need this, but surely it's just applying the same logic. Also, there's the fact that the Pokédex describes the core of Staryu's body as an organ, so I guess its organ has just been strapped on to its legs, I guess. It's just such an obscure and forgettable detail attached to a Pokemon that, without that detail, would be symmetrical. It just kind of bothers me for some reason. And it's so forgetful, in fact, that Game Freak themselves also forgot about this. In Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire, of course, every Pokemon has a back sprite, including Staryu, but that attachment to its leg, connecting its core, is nowhere to be seen until Emerald, where Game Freak, I guess, remembered it exists. And now, since we're talking about Starmie, I think I have to pay attention to the new Mega Evolution Starmie received in Pokemon Legends EA. Okay. I do have to say though, I kind of love this Pokemon just because others don't. I think it is funny how people can actually get upset and angry over a 3D Pokemon model and design just because it isn't, I don't know, super menacing in a way. I think we've also had so many Megas at this point. I'm completely fine with one or two being completely goofy like this and Mega Slowbro. In fact, sometimes I prefer these designs. Or maybe it's because I love sitting back watching a mob get angry over a Pokemon they've never even talked about before. But if you do want to get mad at a Pokemon's 3D model, please, by all means, get mad at Keldeo's, specifically in Sword and Shield. See, before Pokemon had 3D models, you would simply have to reflect the 2D sprite depending on whether you were facing that Pokemon in battle or you were viewing it on its summary screen. However, as you can imagine, reflecting the Pokemon directly doesn't always make a lot of sense, especially with asymmetrical Pokemon designs, like Roselia. If you simply reflect that Pokemon design, suddenly which flower is on which arm doesn't actually make any sense. And of course, when 3D Pokemon models debuted in X and Y, this was completely solved, as now you don't have to just reflect a 3D model, but since it's 3D, you can just rotate it. Problem solved, kind of. For whatever reason, in Sword and Shield, Keldeo in the summary screen and in your box will not face the right way. It faces the right way, but not the right way, if you know what I mean. I don't know why this is a thing, and it's a common misconception that Keldeo only debuted in Sword and Shield's DLC, the Crown Tundra, but that's just not true. This Pokemon was available long before that, when players finally got access to Pokemon Home, which makes this fact even weirder, because not only can I think of no reason why Keldeo has this treatment and is facing the wrong way, but why have Game Freak never patched this, considering they've had so many opportunities to do so? Another Pokemon I can't find a reason behind is Heatran. Heatran, for whatever reason, has a 3D model where whenever that Pokemon's asleep, it doesn't close its eyes. Side note, Heatran is not a legendary Pokemon. I don't care what anyone says. If it is, then so is Rotom, even though now it's just a phone, I guess. This is a weird detail about Heatran though, because Game Freak and Pokemon seem to be doing this on purpose. It's been around since X and Y and is still around today in Scarlet and Violet. You can even see Heatran when it's sleeping in a picnic. You can see its eyes dim, but its eyes don't shut, meaning this is an intentional design by Game Freak, although it doesn't really make any sense for that Pokemon. It's not like Heatran is known for always being awake or alert. This feature would make a lot more sense in a Pokemon like Noctowl, for example, but for whatever reason, Heatran has this ability. This next entry on the list is my personal favorite. The Pokemon Company and their developers have been criticized over the years for reusing the same 3D Pokemon models over and over, game after game. Some Pokemon models have received updates, especially in Scarlet and Violet, that, like I said with Charizard, make it look a lot better. However, most of the Pokemon kind of just received a slap with a metallic texture and Game Freak just called it a day. And back in Sun and Moon, there were no Pokemon that even received any updates to their 3D model, apart from one. For whatever reason, Game Freak updated Glameow's 3D model in Sun and Moon and changed the position of its ears. Because, you know, we needed that. That's it, that's the change. This, of course, is so random and just makes me beg the question, why didn't other Pokemon, even if it was just one, receive an updated 3D model? Especially since there is another notorious cat Pokemon whose 3D model has been criticized ever since X and Y, that being Purloin. Purloin, for some reason, stands up on its hind legs and it just makes me feel uncomfortable. But no, I guess Glameow had to be updated. What's even weirder about this whole thing is that in X and Y, again the model's debut, and in Sun and Moon, the model's update, you couldn't catch a Glameow. You could of course trade it to your game either with Oras or Pokemon Bank, but yeah, you could not directly obtain Glameow in those games, making this choice even stranger. And the last 3D model oddity I want to talk about belongs to the Pokemon Ultra Necrozma. Such an enigma and a Pokemon I've talked about countless times on this channel already. Unlike the other model details we've covered in this list, this Pokemon has a 3D model detail that you will never find even if you look for it. You see, every 3D model comes with a fainting animation. It's the same reason why I think 3D models are a little underrated, especially for all the development and effort put into every single one of them, including Glameow's ears. The weird thing is that Ultra Necrozma's fainting animation contains a really cool detail where the Pokemon slowly separates into parts and they, well, fall apart onto the floor. While Pokemon faint and their fainting animation plays, they also at the same time shrink down in size until they're just not on the screen anymore. But the problem with Ultra Necrozma is that Game Freak simply made this fainting animation too long, like way too long. And so Ultra Necrozma has shrank down into nothing way before this animation even starts to play. The only reason we can actually view this is thanks to data miners. And I guess it just goes to show game development is pretty hard. There's a lot of things to consider, and again, I think 3D models deserve a little bit of praise for this, even though sometimes things can slip through the cracks. But that about wraps it up. And if you can think of any more obscurities around 3D Pokemon models I haven't already covered in this video, let me know in the comment section down below. Thanks so much for watching, and if you want to find out just what are the most forgettable routes in the whole mainline Pokemon games, click here to see me talk about just that. Thanks for watching.